The Whispering Bones of St.Mary Mead, Chapter 1. The English village of St.Mary Mead has never been a place for haste. Time here is not measured in seconds and minutes, but in the slow, deliberate turning of the seasons. It is measured in the growth of a rose in a cottage garden, the gradual fading of paint on a garden gate, and the accumulation of dust on secrets long thought buried. The clock in the corner of Miss Jane Marple's sitting room ticked with a particular, relentless patience, as if it, like its owner, knew that all things come to light eventually. It was the autumn of 1953, and the village was about to be reminded of that very fact. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite chintz armchair by the window, was engaged in the dual pursuits of knitting and observation. Her needles clicked a softer, more complex counterpoint to the grandfather clock. Her project, a seemingly endless matinee jacket in pale lemon wool for a great niche she rarely saw, was, as always, merely a prop. Her true occupation was the study of human nature, and her laboratory was a world beyond her lace curtains. She noted the way the postman, young Billy Fawcett, lingered at the gate of Laburnum Cottage that afternoon. Not his usual brisk pace. A full 30 seconds he stood, looking at the front door as if it might speak to him, and his shoulders were set, not with anticipation, but with a distinct air of dread. A curious thing, she thought. The mind, of course, leaps the possibilities. A final demand? A letter from a sweetheart he wishes to avoid? Or something altogether less domestic? Her gaze, pale and china blue, then shifted to note the progress of a sleek, black Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire as it purred down the narrow high street, a foreign beast in a land of bicycles and farm carts. Mr. Sebastian Croft's new motorcar. So very shiny, she mused. Like a beetle. They said his import business was flourishing. From pharmaceuticals, wasn't it? Or was it textiles? One does forget. But it was a great deal of money for a man so young to possess. It put one in mind of old Mr. Hargreaves, the solicitor's clerk from her youth. He always had a new waistcoat before anyone else, and we all know how that turned out. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. The world might see a dithering old lady, but behind the gentle facade was a mind like a steel trap, baited with a profound and unshakable cynicism about the inherent fallibility of mankind. Her wisdom was not drawn from books of law or criminology, but from a lifetime of observing the petty jealousies, the quiet cruelties, and the desperate greeds that flourished in the hothouse atmosphere of a small English village. St.Mary Mead was a Rosetta Stone for deciphering the darkest deeds of the human heart. The gentle rhythm of the afternoon was interrupted by a sharp, clear knock at the front door. Miss Marple set her knitting aside neatly, smoothed her woolen skirt, and rose. She did not hurry. Hurrying, she felt, was undignified and rarely necessary. Upon opening the door, she found Mrs. Clarissa Babbage framed in the doorway. The doctor's wife was a woman in her late 40s, her face a mask of carefully applied powder that failed to conceal the agitation beneath. She prided herself on her robust common sense and her position in the village hierarchy, but today that common sense seemed to have deserted her. Her eyes were wide, and her hands clutched the handle of a shopping basket, as if it were a lifeline. She stammered an excuse about feeling faint, and Miss Marple, with practised calm, ushered her inside and into the sitting-room, promising a restorative cup of tea. Once settled with a cup of steaming Earl Grey, Mrs. Babbage seemed to calm a little, but the fear lingered at the corners of her mouth. She insisted it was probably nothing. Silly, really, just a making a mountain from a molehill. You hear of these things happening in London, she said, but not here, not in St.Mary Mead. Miss Marple, with gentle prodding, spoke of shared troubles and hard burdens, but Mrs. Babbage would not be drawn into talk of the Women's Institute or cake competitions. With a fumbling hand, she reached into her basket and pulled out a small, dote-stained object wrapped in a man's handkerchief. With great care, as if it were a live coal, she placed it on the occasional table between them. It was a locket, a small, tarnished silver locket, oval in shape, on a delicate, broken chain. It was old, perhaps late Victorian, and caked in what looked like fresh, damp earth. Miss Marple, with Mrs. Babbage's nervous permission, picked it up. She expertly prized the stiff, rusty clasp open. Inside, protected by a cloudy piece of glass, was not a photograph, but a tiny, coiled lock of hair. It was a vibrant, unmistakable shade of coppery red. Mrs. Babbage, her voice dropping to a hushed, dramatic whisper, explained that she had found it in her own garden. She was pulling up the last of the runner beans by the old WYCH elm at the bottom of the lawn, and her trowel had struck it. It was just lying there, barely buried, as if it had been churned up by a mole. But that, she insisted, was not the worst of it. "Don't you see," she implored, "the hair?" Everyone of a certain age in the village remembered her. Eloise Finch. The Red Finch, they called her on account of that brilliant, coppery hair. She had disappeared, vanished, the summer of 1923. 30 years ago, almost the day. A silence fell in the room, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock. Miss Marple's face remained a placid mask, but her mind was racing, sifting through decades of village lore and gossip. The name was familiar, a ghost story told to new residents. She had been the housemaid up at Blackwood Manor. A pretty, flighty thing, if the stories were to be believed. It was assumed she had run off to London with a traveling salesman, or perhaps a gypsy. The stories varied. But, Mrs. Babbage whispered, her family never heard from her again. Not a single word. And her mother always swore she would never have left without her locket. Her father had given it to her. It was a most treasured possession. The implication was clear. Mrs. Babbage believed this was Eloise Finch's locket, and the fact that it was found in her garden, barely buried, suggested the girl did not run away to London at all. It suggested she never left St.Mary Mead. It suggested, the doctor's wife said in a terrified whisper, that she had been here all along, under the rose bushes. Miss Marple considered this. She looked from the terrified, respectable face of the doctor's wife to the dainty, poignant little locket in her hand. It was a possibility, of course. But why now? She wondered. After 30 years of quiet slumber, why would this particular secret choose to push its way to the surface now? It was then that Mrs. Babbage produced a final piece of evidence. From her basket, she brought forth a single, folded piece of cheap, lined paper, torn from a child's exercise book. The words, scrawled in a blunt, unpracticed hand, were a stark and simple warning. "Put it back. You don't know what you're digging up." Mrs. Babbage explained it had been pushed through their letterbox that very morning. No stamp, no address. Just that. Her husband, Dr. Babbage, had laughed it off as a prank by one of the village boys. But he hadn't seen the locket. He didn't make the connection. He had been just a boy himself when Eloise vanished. But Mrs. Babbage remembered. She had been at school with Eloise. She was vain and silly, but she didn't deserve this. Miss Marple's tone became decisive. She told Mrs. Babbage she was quite right to bring this to her. She placed the locket and the note back on the table, aligning them neatly. The pieces of the puzzle were assembling themselves before her. A missing girl, a locket with a lock of her hair, found in a garden, a warning note. It was, she reflected, a pattern she had seen before, not in its entirety, but in its components. The greed, the fear, the desperate need to keep the past buried. The first question, she reasoned, was not who killed Eloise Finch, if indeed she was killed. The first question was, who knew the locket was there, and why, after all this time, were they so very anxious that it should remain undiscovered? When Mrs. Babbage asked, voice trembling, if she should go to the police, Miss Marple demurred. Inspector Slack was a capable man in his way, but his imagination was limited to footprints and fingerprints. He dealt in facts, not in whispers, and this, as yet, was a matter of whispers. No, for the moment, discretion was their watchword. Miss Marple instructed Mrs. Babbage to leave the locket and the note with her, and to speak of this to no one. She was to go about her day as she normally would, so the village would see nothing was amiss. As the bewildered but relieved doctor's wife took her leave, Miss Marple rose and returned to her post at the window, looking out once more at the deceptively peaceful village. The black Armstrong Sidley was now parked outside the post office. Children were kicking a pile of autumn leaves. The postman, Billy Fawcett, was walking up the path to Laburnum Cottage, his steps still heavy with that same inexplicable dread. Miss Jane Marple knew what she would do. She would knit, and she would listen. The whispers of the past were growing louder, and she had an excellent ear for a whisper. The Whispering Bones of St.Mary Mead, Chapter 2. The silence that settled in Miss Marple's sitting room after Mrs. Babbage's departure was of a different quality altogether. It was no longer the gentle, companionable quiet of an autumn afternoon, but a thick, pregnant silence, heavy with unspoken truths and the faint, metallic tang of fear. The locket and the crude, threatening note lay side by side on the occasional table, two artifacts from different eras colliding to shatter the present's fragile peace. Miss Marple did not immediately resume her knitting. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the two objects as if they were tea leaves at the bottom of a cup, waiting to yield their story. Her mind, that meticulous filing cabinet of human foibles, began to cross-reference. Eloise Finch. The name conjured a vague image of a girl with a brilliant flame of hair, laughing a little too loudly by the churchyard wall, her eyes always darting towards the horizon as if St.Mary Mead were a cage. The summer of 1923 had been a hot one, she recalled. The flowers had wilted in the gardens, and the air had been thick with the scent of hay and scandal. The official story, that Eloise had run away, had been readily accepted by most. It was convenient. It was tidy. It allowed the village to avert its eyes from the more sordid possibilities. But Eloise's mother, a worn-down woman who took in laundry, had never accepted it. She had maintained, until her dying day, that her daughter would have taken the locket. It was the one thing of beauty she owned. And now, here it was, exhumed not from a deep grave, but from the shallow soil of a doctor's garden. That, to Miss Marple, was the most telling detail of all. It suggested haste, a panicked, shallow burial, not a planned interment. It spoke of an opportunity seized under cover of darkness, not a calculated disposal. And the location, the Babbage Garden, was particularly interesting. 30 years ago, that land had not belonged to the doctor. It had been the kitchen garden for Blackwood Manor itself, the very house where Eloise had been in service. The threads were beginning to weave together, forming a pattern that was, as yet, indistinct but undeniably dark. Later that evening, under the pretext of returning a borrowed recipe for scones, Miss Marple paid a visit to Blackwood Manor. The house was a large, rather gloomy Victorian edifice, all gables and ivy, standing aloof on a rise at the edge of the village. It was now owned by Sebastian Croft, the man with the shiny, beetle-black motorcar. He answered the door himself, a tall, lean man in his late 30s with sleek, dark hair and a smile that seemed to involve only his mouth, not his eyes. He welcomed her with a polished, if slightly condescending, charm. The house behind him was a showpiece of modern design, all sharp angles and abstract art, a stark contrast to the house's original, heavy bones. It felt, Miss Marple thought, like a young cuckoo that had pushed the original nest from a tree and moved in. Over a surprisingly excellent cup of coffee, another imported luxury, Mr. Croft was affable and vague. He knew of the old story. Of course, one heard whispers. A tragic business, but surely all forgotten now? When Miss Marple, with gentle cunning, mentioned the old kitchen garden and how Mrs. Babbage was such a diligent gardener, she watched his face closely. There was no flicker of alarm, only a bland expression of disinterest. He had given the Babbage permission to extend their garden into the old plot. He said, "One must be a good neighbor." He seemed entirely unruffled, his smooth composure a perfect, impenetrable wall. He was either entirely innocent, Miss Marple concluded, or a very cool and calculating customer indeed. Her next port of call, the following morning, was a cottage of Billy Fawcett, the postman. She found him in his small, tidy shed, polishing the brass on his bicycle, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to make a simple task last all day. He was a young man, no more than 25, with a kind, open face that now seemed clouded with worry. Miss Marple's approach was indirect, as always. She inquired after his mother's rheumatism, complimented the shine on his bicycle, and then, as if it were a mere afterthought, mentioned what a fright poor Mrs. Babbage had had, finding some old junk in her flower beds. The effect was immediate and startling. Billy Fawcett's hand, holding the polishing rag, froze. A deep flush crept up his neck, and he would not meet her eye. He muttered something about it probably being nothing, that the gardens were full of old bits and pieces. But his nervousness was palpable, a live wire in the small, oil-scented shed. It was a reaction far more revealing than Sebastian Croft's polished indifference. It was a reaction of a young man who knew something, and whose conscience was troubling him terribly. Miss Marple did not press him. She had learned what she needed to know. The locket's discovery had sent a ripple of fear through more than one person in St. Mary Mead. The following day, a Sunday, brought a new development. As the congregation filed out of St. Mary's Church, buzzing with the usual post-service gossip, Miss Marple observed Dr. Babbage. He was a large, red-faced man, usually full of booming joviality, but today he seemed subdued, his greetings perfunctory. He stood a little apart from his wife, his gaze distant. When Sebastian Croft approached him, clapping him heartily on the back, the doctor flinched almost imperceptibly. The two men spoke for a moment, and Miss Marple, from her vantage point near the lich gate, so Croft's smile never waver, while Dr. Babbage's responses were short, his posture stiff. It was not the easy interaction of friends. There was a tension there, a current of something unspoken. Was it the shared knowledge of what lay in the doctor's garden? Or was it something else entirely? The pieces on her mental chessboard were moving. Sebastian Croft, the wealthy, enigmatic newcomer, comfortable and unruffled. Dr. Babbage, the pillar of a community, now visibly uneasy. Billy Fawcett, the honest postman, terrified of a piece of buried silver. And at the center of it all, the ghost of Eloise Finch, her copper hair still blazing from within a tarnished locket. That evening, as dusk began to bleed into night, painting the village in shades of violet and gray, Miss Marple decided a little fresh air was in order. She took a slow, deliberate stroll, her footsteps quiet on the pavement. Her route was not random. It took her past Laburnum Cottage, the home of Billy Fawcett and his ailing mother. A light burned in the downstairs window, and through the gap in the curtains, she saw Billy, not polishing his bicycle, but sitting at a table, his head in his hands. It was a picture of utter dejection. She was about to move on when a flicker of movement in the shadows across the street caught her expert eye. A figure, tall and lean, stood partially concealed by the thick trunk of an oak tree. It was Sebastian Croft. He was not moving, not walking his dog or taking the air. He was simply standing, watching Billy Fawcett's cottage with an intensity that was both still and predatory. He was a man waiting for something. Or someone. Miss Marple retreated into the deeper shadows of a garden wall, her heart beating a little faster. This was no longer just a mystery from the past. It was a live, unfolding drama. The watcher was being watched. Croft stood there for a full 5 minutes before, with a final, lingering look at the cottage window, he turned and melted away into the darkness, his footsteps silent on the leafy lane. The following morning, the news ran through St. Mary Mead like a brush fire. It was not about a locket or a 30-year-old disappearance. It was about something more immediate, and to the villagers, more shocking. Billy Fawcett had not done his round. The post was late, and when a concerned neighbor had knocked on the door of Laburnum Cottage, they found Billy's mother alone, confused and worried. Her son, she said, had gone out late last night after receiving a note, and he had not returned home. Billy Fawcett had vanished. The Whispering Bones of St. Mary Mead, Chapter 3. The disappearance of a postman in a village like St. Mary Mead was an event of seismic proportions. It was not merely the inconvenience of undelivered mail or the worry for a neighbor's welfare. It was a tear in the very fabric of their orderly world. A milk bottle could be late, a train could be missed, but the postman was as reliable as a dawn. His absence spoke of a disorder so profound it sent a chill through the community, a chill that the crisp autumn sunshine could not dispel. Whispers replaced greetings on the high street. Curtains twitched with a new, more frantic energy. The village, for the first time in decades, felt afraid. Miss Marple received the news from her housekeeper, the irrepressible and well-connected Cherry, who delivered it with a mixture of dread and relish over the breakfast kedgeree. Miss Marple listened. Her expression won a polite concern, but her mind was already racing, connecting this new, alarming event to the dainty locket lying in her writing desk. Coincidence, she had long believed, was a concept used by the lazy and the blind. In her experience, there was no such thing. Billy Fawcett's vanishing act was a direct consequence of the Finch girl's locket being unearthed. She was sure of it. The official machinery, in the form of Inspector Slack, grumbled into action. He was a man who disliked mysteries that originated before his time in the force, and he particularly disliked mysteries that involved what he called old women's fancies. He interviewed a distraught Mrs. Fawcett, who confirmed her son had gone out after receiving a note, the contents of which he did not know. He had seemed anxious, she said, but determined. He had not taken his bicycle. Inspector Slack organized a search party, focusing on the woods and fields surrounding the village, operating on the assumption that the young man had met with an accident, a fall, a twisted ankle, and a rabbit hole. It was a practical, physical approach that entirely missed the psychological heart of the matter. Miss Marple, however, operated on a different plane. While the search parties beat the bushes, she engaged in her own form of investigation. She took a walk past a Burnham cottage, offering her condolences to Billy's mother, and taking careful note of the lane outside. It was a soft, muddy track after the previous night's dew, and it told a story to her trained eye. There were the deep, purposeful impressions of Inspector Slack's sturdy boots. There were the scattered, overlapping prints of the curious neighbors. But leading away from the cottage gate, she identified a single set of footprints. They were from a man's shoe, neat, with a distinctive, sharp-edged tread. They were not the heavy, worn boots of a laborer, nor the scuffed shoes of a young postman. They were the prints of someone who took care with his appearance. They walked purposefully down the lane, before being lost on the harder surface of the high street. Her next stop was a village shop, where the purchase of a single stamp could be spun into a 20-minute conversation. Under the guise of worrying about a parcel she was expecting, Miss Marple engaged the postmistress, Mrs. Wilding, in conversation. She gently steered the topic toward Billy, his reliability, his state of mind. Had he seemed troubled lately? Mrs. Wilding, a fount of information, was only too happy to unburden herself. Oh, indeed he had, she confided. For the past week or so, ever since that business with the old Finch girl's locket started buzzing around, Billy had been jumpy, and just yesterday, she recalled, he had asked her a most peculiar question. He had wanted to know if a letter posted in St.Mary Mead could be traced back to the person who posted it, if it didn't have a return address. A curious question for a postman to ask. The pieces were shifting, locking together with a soft, terrible click. Billy had been frightened. He had known something about the locket, and he had been lured out by a note he had perhaps been expecting, or at least dreading. The man with the sharp-treaded shoes had likely delivered that note, and Miss Marple had a very good idea who that man might be. Later that afternoon, she paid a call on Dr. Babbage. She found him in his study, surrounded by medical texts, but he was not reading. He was staring into the cold, empty fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, though the hour was early. He looked up as she entered, and his attempt at a welcoming smile was a ghastly failure. The joviality was entirely gone from his face, replaced by a gray, profound anxiety. Miss Marple did not mention Billy Fawcett directly. Instead, she spoke of the strain the recent events must be placing on his wife, on the delicate constitution of a woman like Clarissa. She mentioned, as if in passing, what a kind young man Billy was, always so patient with the elderly residents on his round. She watched the doctor's face as she spoke. At the mention of Billy's name, his knuckles tightened around the glass, and he took a swift, nervous swallow. He was a man, she thought, who was desperately afraid of what the silence in the woods might yield. Was he afraid for Billy? Or afraid of what Billy might say, if he were found? It was as she was taking her leave, the doctor's relief at her departure palpable, that she saw it. Lying on the whole table, carelessly discarded beside a pile of letters, was a heavy, silver fountain pen. It was an expensive, distinctive model, not the kind of practical instrument a busy country doctor would use. Engraved on the cap were not the doctor's initials, but a sleek, minimalist design that she recognized. It was the same logo that was discreetly displayed on the dashboard of Sebastian Croft's Armstrong Siddeley. The doctor and Mr. Croft were on terms familiar enough for a personal item to be left behind. Or perhaps, she thought, it had been delivered recently, along with a message. The search party returned at dusk, their faces grim and their efforts fruitless. They had found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no discarded clothing, not a single clue. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed Billy Fawcett whole. The mood in the village shifted from anxiety to a deeper, more superstitious dread. The ghost of Eloise Finch, it was whispered, was claiming fresh victims. But Miss Marple did not believe in ghosts. She believed in human greed, human fear, and human fallibility. That evening, as she sat in her chair, the ticking of the clock seeming louder and more portentous than ever, she laid out the facts as she knew them. A girl vanishes. Her locket is found 30 years later. A postman who reacts with terror to its discovery himself disappears after a mysterious note. A wealthy, Polish man watches a postman's house from the shadows. A doctor, connected to both the garden and the wealthy man, is drowning in fear, and linking the mole, the muddy, shallow grave of a silver locket. The pattern was becoming clearer now. It was a pattern of knowledge and of silence. Someone had killed Eloise Finch. Someone else had known about it, or suspected. And now, 3 decades on, that secret was threatening to erupt, and the people involved were scrambling to protect themselves, their positions, their very lives. Billy Fawcett, she feared, had been caught in the middle. He was not a villain, he was a pawn. And pawns, in her experience, were often the first to be sacrificed. The following morning, the search resumed. But this time, Miss Marple did not stay in the village to listen to the whispers. She put on her stout walking shoes and her warmest coat, and she set out, not for the woods where the men were searching, but in the opposite direction, towards a derelict, overgrown grounds of the old Blackwood Manor kitchen garden, the place where it had all begun. She had a feeling, a quiet, persistent intuition, that the past would not give up its secrets in the daylight, with a crowd. It would only whisper them to someone who was willing to listen, alone. The Whispering Bones of St.Mary Mead, Chapter 4. The old kitchen garden of Blackwood Manor lay not behind the main house, as one might expect, but down a gentle, south-facing slope separated from the Babbage Currant lawn by a low, crumbling stone wall, now almost submerged in a tangle of nettles and ivy. It was a forgotten place, a square of land that time had decided to bypass. The air was still and cold, and the sunlight that filtered through the canopy of the great WYCH elm seemed thinner, paler than the light in the rest of the village. Miss Marple stood at its edge, her hands tucked into her pockets, her gaze sweeping over the scene with the quiet intensity of a botanist searching for a rare and poisonous weed. She did not step into the garden immediately. First, she observed. She noted the recent disturbance where Mrs. Babbage had been digging up her runner beans, the earth still dark and loose. She saw the deeper, more chaotic gouges left by the police search party, their heavy boots having trampled any subtler signs that might have existed. But it was the periphery of the garden that interested her most, the places where the wilderness began to reclaim its own. A path, little more than a memory, led from the stone wall towards a dilapidated, moss-covered structure half hidden by brambles. The old ice house. It was a small, domed brick building, built into the slope of the hill, a relic from an era before electric refrigeration. It was there, near the entrance to this forgotten vault, that her eyes, sharpened by a lifetime of noticing what others overlooked, caught a discrepancy. A single, pale green leaf from a sycamore tree lay atop the brambles, but it was not resting naturally. Its underside, a lighter, almost silver hue, was facing up. It had been flipped over, recently, by something passing through the thicket. And the brambles themselves were not entirely undisturbed. A few of the thorny vines were newly broken, their snapped ends still pale and moist. Her heart, for a moment, beat a little faster against her ribs. This was not the broad, clumsy passage of a search party. This was a single, furtive trail. Steeling herself, and using her sturdy walking stick to push the thorny branches aside, Miss Marple approached the ice house. The old wooden door, rotten and sagging on its iron hinges, was not quite closed. A dark, narrow gap promised entry. A faint, damp, and oath-laden chill emanated from within, carrying a scent of decayed leaves and cold stone. She did not call out. It was a foolish thing to do in the circumstances, and Miss Jane Marple was never foolish. Instead, she leaned closer to the gap, peering into the gloom. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The interior was a small, circular chamber, the brick dome creating a strange acoustic that seemed to swallow sound. The floor was packed earth, and there, curled on its side near the far wall, was a shape that resolved itself, with a terrible, sinking clarity, into the form of a man. It was Billy Fawcett. His postman's uniform was rumpled and dirty, and one arm was thrown out as if in a final, desperate reach for the sliver of light from the doorway. He was not moving. For a long, silent moment, Miss Marple stood there, her hand pressed to her mouth. It was not a gasp of surprise, but a quiet, sad acceptance of a truth she had already, in her heart, known. The pawn had been sacrificed. She offered a small, silent prayer for his soul, this kind young man who had been caught in a web-spun long before he was born. Then, the detective in her took over, pushing the sorrow aside to be examined later. She carefully, without touching the door or the frame, widened the gap just enough to see more. He had not been there long. There was no advanced decay, only the pallor of death. There was no visible blood, no obvious sign of a struggle in the immediate vicinity. It looked as if he had been struck down quickly, or perhaps had hidden here and died of exposure. But her eyes, adjusting further, caught a glint of something metallic near his outstretched hand. It was not the locket. It was a fountain pen. A heavy, silver fountain pen, its cap lying a few inches away, as if it had rolled from his grasp. It was the pen she had seen on Dr. Babbitt's hall table. The pen with Sebastian Croft's distinctive logo. The implications crashed together in her mind like waves. Billy had this pen. How? Did he take it from the doctor's house? Had it been given to him? Was it a payment, or a token? Or was it, as her more cynical mind suggested, a plant? A piece of evidence deliberately left to point the investigation in a specific direction. She knew she could not touch it. This was now a matter for Inspector Slack and the proper authorities, however much they might bungle the subtleties. She retreated from the ice house as quietly as she had come, her mind already working on the problem of how to alert the police without revealing her own presence at the scene. A direct report would lead to endless, time-consuming questions and Slack's condescension. She needed an intermediary. She made her way back to the stone wall, and with a careful, deliberate motion, she knocked her walking stick against the handle of a garden shears, which she had brought as a plausible prop for her walk. The metallic clang was sharp and clear in the quiet air. She waited a moment, then did it again, more insistently. Within minutes, a concerned-looking man from the search party, who had been beating the bushes in a field adjacent to the manor grounds, came hurrying over. "Miss Marple, are you quite all right? Have you taken a fall?" "Oh, no, my dear boy, I am perfectly fine," she said, her voice a little breathless, a masterclass in feigned, flustered old age. "But I was just looking for some late-blooming monkshood. It does sometimes thrive in such neglected spots, you know, and I happened to glance into that dreadful old ice house. I do believe, that is to say, I fear I may have seen something. A boot. It looked very much like young Billy's. I do hope I am mistaken, but perhaps one of you strong young men should take a look." It was enough. The man's face went from concern to grim understanding. He helped her over the wall and called out to his companions. The search, which had been languishing, was suddenly re-energized with a terrible, grim purpose. Miss Marple, pleading fatigue and shock, was escorted back to the lane by a young constable. As she walked away, she heard the shouts as the men converged on the ice house, their voices sharp with the macabre excitement of discovery they had all dreaded. She did not look back. She had seen what she needed to see. Billy Fawcett was dead, and beside his body lay a silver pen that connected Dr. Babbage and Sebastian Croft to this fresh tragedy. The whispers of the past had now erupted into a scream. The 30-year-old secret had demanded a blood payment, and Billy, poor, terrified Billy, had been the first to pay it. But Miss Marple knew, with a cold certainty, that he would not be the last. The killer of Eloise Finch was still here, in St.Mary Mead, and they were desperate enough to kill again to keep their secret buried. The Whispering Bones of St.Mary Mead, Part 5. A dead body, once discovered, changes everything. The abstract fear that had haunted St. Mary Mead solidified into a cold, hard dread with the finding of Billy Fawcett in the ice house. The village was no longer whispering. It was holding its breath. Police constables, their faces set in grim lines, became a permanent fixture, their presence a constant reminder that a killer walked among them. The ice house was now a tomb, cordoned off with ropes that fluttered like ragged flags, marking the spot where the past had finally claimed its first modern victim. From her armchair, Miss Marple observed the aftermath. She had played her part perfectly, the kindly, startled old lady who had stumbled upon a gruesome scene. Inspector Slack, now in his element with a fresh homicide, had barely glanced her way. He was a man who dealt in fingerprints and footprints, not in the subtle echoes of long-dead scandals. He was welcome to his fountain pen. She knew its placement was too convenient, a deliberate piece of stagecraft designed to point a finger away from the true architect of this tragedy. The official word, which Cherry delivered with hushed solemnity, was that Billy had been struck on the head a single brutal blow. Robbery was not a motive. His wallet was untouched. The pen was the only anomalous item, a shiny, expensive enigma lying in the date. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking a steady rhythm against the rising tide of village anxiety. The pen was not a clue, it was a message, and she was beginning to understand the language. Her solitude was broken by a timid knock. There, on her doorstep, stood Mrs. Fawcett, her small frame seeming to collapse in on itself under the weight of her grief. Her eyes were raw, her hands trembling. She had come, she whispered, because Billy had always said Miss Marple saw things others missed. And she had a burden, a secret she had carried for 30 years, that she could no longer bear alone. Seated by the fire with a cup of sweet, strong tea, the story emerged, halting and stained with tears. Long before she was Mrs. Fawcett, she was young Lily, a scullery maid at Blackwood Manor. On the night Eloise Finch vanished, Lily had stolen away to meet a young footman in the rose garden. It was there, hidden by the scent of damask roses in the cover of night, that she saw them. Eloise, her hair a fiery banner in the moonlight, was in the old kitchen garden, not with a stranger, but in a furious, passionate argument with the young master of the house, Lawrence Croft. He was home from Oxford, handsome, wild, and utterly out of reach for a housemaid. The scene was one of intense, private drama, a world away from the tale of a girl running off with a gypsy. Miss Marple felt a quiet, definitive click in her mind, as if a key had turned in a well-oiled lock. Sebastian Croft was not merely a new owner. He was a scion. He had returned to his family's seat, not just as a wealthy man, but as an heir tasked with silencing the ghost that threatened his legacy. The locket, surfacing in land that was once his family's, was not an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to his name. But Mrs. Fawcett's confession was not yet complete. Through her sobs, she revealed the rest. Her Billy, with a postman's knowledge of every soul in the village and a young man's thirst for justice, had pieced it together. He had guessed a connection between the locket, the Croft family, and the body it signified. He had, in a moment of foolish courage, confronted Sebastian Croft. He had demanded answers, perhaps even threatened exposure. And for his bravery, he had received a note, a summons to a meeting in the dark. He had shown it to his mother, his face pale but determined. "It's to make things right, Mum," he'd said. They were the last words she ever heard him speak. After seeing the broken woman out, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the twilight deepen over St.Mary Mead. The pattern was now starkly clear. Lawrence Croft had killed Eloise Finch in a moment of passion or panic. His son, Sebastian, had returned to a village nursing that old, half-forgotten secret, only to have it erupt from the very soil. Billy Fawcett, armed with his mother's memory, had become a lethal liability. But one thread still dangled, loose and puzzling. Dr. Babbage. His fear was too profound, too personal. It was not the abstract fear of scandal, but the specific terror of a man who had dirted his own hands. The answer came to her with sudden, chilling clarity. The locket was merely the marker. When it was found, Dr. Babbage, a man of science and logic, would have known what it meant. He would have gone back, alone, and dug deeper, and he would have found the true remains of Eloise Finch. His panic would have been immediate. The scandal, the grisly discovery on his property, it would have ruined him. So he had moved her. He had taken the bones of the dead girl and hidden them somewhere else, hoping to sever the connection between the locket and his land forever. The ice house? It was a likely temporary tomb. But Billy must have discovered this, too. He knew not only who the original killer was, but also the man who had desecrated the grave. He held two damning secrets. And for that, he had to die. Sebastian Croft was a murderer, protecting his bloodline. Dr. Babbage was an accomplice after the fact, protecting his home and his reputation. The pen was Croft's attempt to shift the blame for Billy's murder onto the doctor, creating a tidy narrative of a blackmail plot gone wrong between accomplices. It was an elegant, terrible theory, but it was woven from gossamer threads of intuition and old memories. To convince Inspector Slack, she needed something he could not ignore. She needed the testimony that had been silenced for 30 years. She needed to find the final resting place of Eloise Finch and let the bones themselves tell the last chapter of the story. The Whispering Bones of St.Mary Mead, Chapter 6. Armed with the terrible clarity of Mrs. Fawcett's confession, Miss Marple's path forward was now obvious, though fraught with difficulty. She possessed the truth, but it was a truth built on the foundation of a grieving mother's memory and her own understanding of the sinuous ways of human wickedness. It was not evidence. Inspector Slack would dismiss it as the ramblings of two old women, tangled in grief and imagination. To bring the matter to a close, to see justice done for both Eloise Finch and Billy Fawcett, she needed the final, undeniable proof. She needed the bones. The question was, where would a frightened, respectable man like Dr. Babbage hide a set of human remains? The ice house had been a temporary solution at best, a holding place in the panic of the moment. It was too close to the original grave, too obvious once anyone started looking. He would have wanted them gone, disposed of permanently. But how? He was not a man of the land, who would think of burying them deep in the woods. He was a man of science, of order. He would want them hidden, but also contained. He would want them somewhere no one would ever think to look, a place that was both secret and, in its own way, final. Her mind drifted to the doctor's habits. He was a creature of routine. Every Sunday, he attended St. Mary's Church, sitting in the third pew on the left, without fail. He was on the parish council, responsible for the upkeep of the churchyard. The churchyard. It was a place of eternal rest, but also a place of quiet, sanctioned earth moving. A new grave was a monumental task, but an old one. The yew tree in the far corner, its trunk thick and gnarled with centuries, its roots like great, knotted fingers gripping the soil. The earth there was always soft, disturbed by the ancient roots, a place where flowers were rarely planted. It was a spot that offered a kind of blasphemous sanctuary. To hide a body in a graveyard was a monstrous act, but a brilliantly cynical one. Who would think to look for a set of illicit bones among a congregation of the properly buried? That evening, under the cover of a moonless sky, Miss Marple undertook a walk she would never have ordinarily considered. Wrapped in a dark coat, a small, sturdy trowel from her own gardening basket in her pocket, she moved through the sleeping village like a shadow. The churchyard was silent, the headstones pale, looming shapes in the profound darkness. The air was cold and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying flowers. She felt a profound sense of unease, a feeling that she was trespassing not just on property, but on peace itself. But the thought of Billy Fawcett and the girl he had tried to avenge steeled her resolve. She went straight to the great yew tree in the far corner, its dark foliage a deeper black against the night sky. Using a small pocket torch, its beam narrowed to a sliver, she examined the ground at its base. The soil was indeed loose, different from the packed earth around the other graves. It looked, to her experienced gardener's eye, as if it had been recently turned over and then hastily smoothed out. There were no flowers, no marker. It was an anonymous patch of ground, perfect for secret. She worked quickly, her breath pluming in the chill air. The trowel bit into the soft earth with a soft, shushing sound that seemed deafening in the silence. She did not dig a deep hole, merely a small, exploratory trench, enough to see what lay just beneath the surface. Her trowel had not gone more than 6 inches down, when it struck something that was neither stone nor root. It was a dull, dry clunk. She brushed the soil away with her hands, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. There, nestled in the earth, was a long, unmistakable shape, stained brown with time. A human femur. She had found her. Eloise Finch had come to her final, unhallowed rest in the shadow of the church, hidden by the man who had sworn an oath to preserve life. At that moment, a beam of light, bright and official, cut through the darkness, pinning her in its glare. "And what, pray tell, do you think you are doing?" The voice was hard, incredulous. It was Inspector Slack. He and a young constable had been making a final round of the village, their path taking them past the churchyard gate. The sight of a flickering light under the yew tree had been too suspicious to ignore. Miss Marple, caught kneeling in the dirt with a bone and a trowel, presented a picture that defied all logical explanation. She did not panic. Instead, she slowly got to her feet, brushing the soil from her knees. "I am providing you with your evidence, Inspector," she said, her voice remarkably calm. "The remains of Eloise Finch. I believe you will find they have been moved from their original resting place in the Babbage garden." Slack stayed, his mouth slightly agape, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the scene before him with his understanding of the world. An old lady, a graveyard, a bone. It was nonsense, but the bone was very real. How did you? Why are you? He spluttered. The why is a long story. Inspector, Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. But the who is what concerns us now. Dr. Babbage moved these bones to hide the original crime. But he is not your murderer. The man who killed Billy Fawcett, and the man whose father killed this poor girl, is Sebastian Croft. And if you proceed to his house now, I believe you will find him in the process of preparing to leave St.Mary Mead forever. A man does not buy a large, fast motor car for the narrow lanes of a village. He buys it for a quick escape. The sheer, audacious certainty in her tone cut through Slack's confusion. The bizarre scene, the discovered remains, the clear, unshakable logic of her accusation. It was too much to ignore. He barked an order to the constable to guard the site, then turned on his heel, his disbelief now transformed into a grim, purposeful energy. He strode off towards a high street in Blackwood Manor, his footsteps echoing in the silent night. Miss Marple did not follow. Her part was done. The wheels of official justice, however clumsy, were now in motion. She looked down once more at the exposed bone, a stark, pale shape in the dark earth. She offered a silent, heartfelt apology to the girl who had been denied peace for so long. The whispers had been heard at last. All that remained was the arrest. The Whispering Bones of St.Mary Mead, Chapter 8. The confrontation at Blackwood Manor was not one of dramatic chases or flying bullets, but something far more suited to the quiet venom of the case, a tense, civilized conversation in a drawing room, where the weapons were words and the stakes were a man's soul. Inspector Slack, his initial skepticism burned away by the shocking discovery in the churchyard, confronted Sebastian Croft with a blunt, official force that brooked no polite evasion. Miss Marple, at Slack's own grudging invitation, was present as a silent witness, a small, still figure in a chintz armchair, her eyes missing nothing. Croft, impeccably dressed as if for a London board meeting rather than a late-night police interview, initially maintained his facade of polished bewilderment. He was shocked, truly shocked, about the poor postman. He had barely known the man. As for the fantastic tale of some bones under a yew tree, he had no knowledge whatsoever. It was all a tragic, sordid misunderstanding, likely stemming from the overactive imaginations of villagers with too much time on their hands. His voice was a model of reason, but a faint sheen of perspiration on his brow betrayed him. It was then that Inspector Slack, following the trail Miss Marple had laid for him, played his hand. He mentioned the fountain pen, found by Billy Fawcett's body. He mentioned the testimony of Mrs. Fawcett, who placed Croft's own father at the scene of Eloise Finch's disappearance. And then he delivered the masterstroke, the piece of evidence that could not be explained away, the testimony of a London colleague from Croft's import business, who, when quietly contacted by telephone, confirmed that Sebastian Croft had been asking very specific, very nervous questions about the legalities of exhuming and moving human remains, just days after the locket was found. The polished mask shattered. Croft's face, for a fleeting second, was a canvas of pure, unadulterated panic. He had not just been protecting his father's name. He had been actively, clumsily, trying to manage the fallout, to silence the whispers his father had left behind. He had gone to Dr. Babbage, not as a stranger, but as the son of the man whose crime now lay in the doctor's garden. He had likely threatened, cajoled, or bribed the doctor into moving the body, ensuring the original sin of the Croft family would not literally blight the property he had worked so hard to reclaim. But Billy Fawcett, with his local knowledge and his mother's secret, had pieced it all together and become a threat that could not be managed, only eliminated. Seeing his defenses crumble, Miss Marple finally spoke, her voice soft yet filling the room with its quiet authority. She did not accuse, she simply recounted. She spoke of patterns, of how the vanity of a young master and the fear of his son were, in their essence, no different from the petty jealousies and desperate cover-ups she had observed in 100 village scandals. She spoke of the locket, not as a piece of evidence, but as a symbol of a young girl's life, carelessly snuffed out and then callously buried. She spoke of Billy Fawcett's terrible courage, and the price he paid for it. "You saw your family's legacy, Mr. Croft," she said, her pale blue eyes fixed on him. "But you saw it as a thing of stone and mortar, a name to be polished. You fail to see that a legacy is also built on the lives one touches, and the debts one leaves unpaid. This house was built on a forgotten grave. You could have chosen to bring that darkness into the light, to atone. Instead, you chose to add another body to the foundation. It was this, more than Slack's direct accusations, that broke him. The moral weight of her words, the sheer, unassailable clarity of her vision, was a burden his guilty conscience could no longer bear. The sleek, modern businessman slumped, his shoulders collapsing inwards. The story poured out, a confession woven from family pride and cold fear. He admitted to confronting Billy, to luring him to the ice house with a promise of money and a full confession. But when Billy, righteous and angry, had refused to be bought and had threatened to go to the police, Croft had seen his whole world, his wealth, his name, his hard-won respectability, crumbling to dust. He had acted in a blind panic, seizing a heavy piece of fallen brick from the ice house wall. The blow had been swift, terrible, and final. Planting the pen was a desperate, last-minute attempt to divert suspicion onto the already compromised Dr. Babbage. As Slack read him his rights and the constable led a broken Sebastian Croft away, the drawing-room felt suddenly hollow and cold. The elegant furniture and abstract art seemed like a pathetic disguise for the rottenness that had festered within. The case was solved. The murderer was caught. Justice, of a sort, would be served. Yet, as Miss Marple was escorted home by a silent and, for once, respectful Inspector Slack, she felt no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness. 2 young people were dead, 2 families shattered, and a village's innocence irrevocably lost, all to preserve the hollow shell of a reputation. It was a terrible, wasteful price. The following morning, the news spread through St.Mary Mead with the speed of a river in flood. The arrest of Sebastian Croft, the confession, the grim discovery of Eloise Finch's true resting place. It was a drama far exceeding any the village had ever known. The villagers, now that the danger had passed, spoke in hushed, excited tones, dissecting every clue, every interaction, with a perfect clarity of hindsight. Dr. Babbage, confronted by Slack, confessed his own part with a shuddering relief. The weight of his secret had been crushing him. He confirmed that Croft had indeed pressured him into moving the skeleton, using a mixture of threats and promises to ensure his compliance. The doctor's own weakness, his fear of scandal, had made him an accomplice to a cover-up that had ultimately led to murder. His reputation, the very thing he sought to protect, was now in tatters. The storm had passed. The police tape came down. The ice house was sealed. But as life in St.Mary Mead began, slowly, to return to a familiar rhythm, Miss Marple knew that some wounds would never fully heal. The whispers had been silenced, but the echoes would remain forever in the quiet lanes and behind the neat lace curtains of the village. She sat in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap, and looked out at the garden. The world, she thought, was full of such hidden sorrows, and it was a duty of those who could see them, to bring them, however painfully, into the light. The Whispering Bones of St.Mary Mead, Final Chapter. The aftermath of a great storm is often quieter than the calm that preceded it. So it was in St.Mary Mead. The frenzy of the investigation, the shock of the arrests, the grim exhumation of Eloise Finch's bones from the unconsecrated grave, all of it subsided, leaving behind a village washed clean by revelation, but also subtly altered, as a landscape is changed by a lightning strike. The talk, of course, continued, but the frantic, fearful edge was gone. It was replaced by a sober, almost reverent understanding of the darkness that had festered in their midst, and a collective, unspoken gratitude for the light that had finally exposed it. Sebastian Croft, in a cold cell, awaited trial for the murder of Billy Fawcett. His confession, once given, was unwavering. The weight of his family's sin and his own had crushed the fight out of him. He was a broken man, his polished world revealed as a hollow shell. Dr. Babbage, stripped of his reputation and his peace, faced charges of obstructing justice and interfering with a corpse. His practice was taken over by a locum from Market Basing, and he and his wife were said to be making arrangements to leave the village, their lives irreparably shattered by a secret that was never theirs to keep. For the Fawcett family, there was a grim comfort of closure. Billy was laid to rest in the churchyard, not far from the yew tree that had held Eloise's secret. The entire village turned out for the funeral, a silent, somber tribute to the postman who had, in his own way, been a brave if tragically naive, seeker of justice. His mother, armed with the knowledge that her son's killer was known, carried her grief with a new dignity. The village would care for her. It was their way. And for Eloise Finch, the girl known only as a Red Finch for so long, there was finally a name, a story, and a proper rest. Her bones, once mingled with the anonymous dead in a pauper's grave after her disappearance was officially recorded, were now identified and given a Christian burial in a corner of the churchyard, a simple headstone marking her existence. The locket, cleaned of its 30 years of soil, was buried with her. The vibrant copper lock of hair within was, at last, reunited with the skull it had once adorned. Through it all, Miss Jane Marple remained the calm, observant center around which this human drama had pivoted. She received no public credit, nor did she desire any. Inspector Slack, in a moment of gruff, professional courtesy, had acknowledged her sharper eyes than most, a compliment of the highest order from him. But the true reward for Miss Marple came in the quiet restoration of order, the sense that the scales of justice, however wobbly, had been balanced. A week after the funerals, on a particularly bright and crisp autumn morning, the vicar paid her a call. Over a slice of cherry cake, he spoke of the profound shock the events had sent through his congregation, but also a newfound sense of community. People were kinder, he noted. They looked out for one another more. It was as if the shared trauma had reminded them of their shared humanity. "It is a terrible business, Miss Marple," he sighed, brushing cake crumbs from his cassock. "But one cannot help but feel that some good has been wrested from the evil. The truth, however painful, is always God's work." "Indeed, Vicar," Miss Marple replied, her gaze drifting to the window where a late rose still clung to its stem. "Truth is a way of pushing through, much like a bulb in spring. One can stamp on the ground above it, but it will always find a way to the light. It is the nature of things." After he left, she sat for a long while in the peaceful silence of her sitting room. The case was closed, the threads neatly tied. Yet her mind, that meticulous filing cabinet, was performing its final act of organization. She saw the whole pattern now, from beginning to end, not as a shocking anomaly, but as a classic, almost predictable human tragedy. The arrogance of the Croft family, the weakness of Dr. Babbage, the vanity of a pretty girl, the courage of a simple postman. She had seen variations of them all in the microcosm of St.Mary Mead. It was, she reflected, all there in the village parallels. Old Mr. Hargreaves in his new waistcoats, a symbol of wealth that outstripped his means. The flighty undergardener's daughter who thought herself too good for the butcher's boy. The pattern was universal. The world, she knew, would see a sensational murder mystery. But she saw a simple, sorrowful story of how the past never truly dies, how it lies in wait, and how the desperate attempt to bury it only gives it greater power. Evil, in her experience, was rarely a grand, theatrical force. It was a quiet, creeping thing, born of selfishness and fear, and it thrived in the silence between polite conversations. That evening, as the clock ticked its patient rhythm and she took up her knitting once more, she felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. The whispers had been stilled. The bones could rest. The village, scarred but resilient, was healing. Outside, the last of the autumn leaves drifted from the sycamore tree. The cycle was turning. Soon it would be winter, a time of stillness and reflection. And Miss Jane Marple, the gentle spinster of St.Mary Mead, would continue to sit by her window, her knitting in her lap, and her keen, understanding eyes watching the world go by. For she knew, with absolute certainty, that human nature was much the same everywhere. And in a village like hers, one had the opportunity to observe it at very close quarters indeed.